So thank you very much to Fabrizio and Marco for giving me the opportunity to present at this conference. What I want to do today is mainly giving reasons for adopting and eventually testing an empirical conjecture to the effect that a certain kind of bodily actions, what I'm going to call motor actions, are categorically perceived. And I'm going to define all of these terms in due course. Let me start with the notion of motor action. Now, these are informally to be conceived as bodily actions such as reaching or grasping. Now, a more formal definition can be given on the basis of the notion of motor outcome. So what is an outcome, first of all? An outcome is an actual or possible state of affairs. But what are motor outcomes in particular? So this is best illustrated by means of an example. Suppose you pick up a letter. What are the conditions under which it is correct to say that the letter is being grasped as opposed to, for example, swept away? Now, in the most ordinary of cases, this is under the condition that the letter ends up between your fingers, for example. But it is also possible to imagine situations in which, for instance, your hands are blocked, and so you grasp the letter with your mouth, for example. I mean, in all of these cases, what is important is that in order to specify the outcome of something being grasped, you need to make reference to one of a series of body parts that send in specific configurations to a given object. So motor outcomes are outcomes whose specification involves mention of body parts and their configurations and an object in relation to which these configurations unfold. And an example is the one that I've just discussed, which is something being grasped, is a typical motor outcome. Now, having given the definition of a motor outcome, I can now define motor actions. First, let me note that motor outcomes are defined behaviorally so far. I mean, up to this point, I haven't yet said anything about the mechanisms underlying their representation. But so motor actions can now be defined as actions directed to motor outcomes. So grasping is a motor action to the extent that it is directed to a motor outcome, something being grasped. So these are the types of bodily action I'm going to be concerned with in the context of this talk. What I want to do is first spell out options for how motor actions could be understood, namely options for how we come to label certain observed bodily movements as certain motor actions or others, so as a grasping as opposed to sweeping away, for instance. After spelling out these options, I'm going to put forward a conjecture that motor actions are categorically perceived, and at that point I'm going to say what categorical perception consists in, and I'm going to provide the steps that lead to this conjecture. And then I'm going to show what would follow for the purposes of the options given at the beginning if the conjecture were true. So let me start with options for how motor actions could be understood. As far as my understanding goes, these can be clustered around these two main options, which I'm going to call behavior reading and outcome identification. Now, what are each of these? In order to spell out their difference, the important thing to bear in mind is a contrast between outcomes on one hand and behavior on the other hand. The important thing about this contrast is that the relationship between outcomes and behaviors is one-to-many. So the same outcome may be fulfilled by means of many different series of movements. So for example, I have this bottle, I could grasp it, with this movement, I mean, there are many series of movements, i.e. many behaviors that could fulfill or bring about the same outcome. So having specified this, it's easier to see what the two different options are about and how they're different from each other. So behavior reading, as the name says, is supposed to rely on the detection of behavior, and it is as such a completely bottom-up process based on the detection of low-level kinematic features alone. So, for example, I might understand the grasping of this bottle as a movement in a certain direction at a certain speed. This is what behavior reading is. By contrast, outcome identification is supposed to be a process that has both bottom-up and top-down components. And as such, it does not just rely on some low-level kinematic features of the action, but it also picks up on the outcome being brought about. For example, it picks up on the fact that this bottle is being grasped, rather than simply relying on the kinematic features of the movements bringing this outcome about. So these are the two different options for how we might come to label an observed series of movements as a motor action or another. And for what I have said so far, both options seem to be open for explaining this process. So now what I'm going to do is introduce this conjecture to the effect that humans categorically perceive motor actions and see what follows from it. I'm going to proceed along these steps. First, I'm going to show that humans categorically perceive facial expressions of certain emotions. Then I'm going to point out that facial expressions of emotions and motor actions are species of the same genus, which is going to start making it probable that the same kind of processing might apply to both domains. And to further substantiate this idea, I'm going to mention evidence for cross-processing among these two domains. The conclusion will be that it is reasonable to suppose, although of course this is then subject to being tested, that also motor actions are categorically perceived. So let me start with showing that humans categorically perceive bodily expressions of certain emotions. And now let me finally say what categorical perception is, and subsequently provide evidence to the effect that humans categorically perceive facial expressions of some emotions. So what is categorical perception? So this is a type of processing that's typically characterized in terms of patterns of heightened discrimination. What does this mean? In the words of Pilling and colleagues, its signature is better discrimination around category boundaries, than for equivalently separated stimuli within the same category. So let me give you an example of this. So now I'm showing you these two category hues, these two color hues, and you should ask yourselves, are these the same or different? You can provide your answer for yourself. Now, same question, are these two the same or different? So no matter, how quickly you were at judging that the bottom two stimuli were different, if you actually understood that they are. For me, it's not obvious, for example, that these two hues of green are different at all. But if you manage to understand that they are different, very likely it took you longer to establish that they're different than with the first two pair of stimuli. But the interesting thing about this case is that these two pairs of stimuli, the two top ones and the two bottom ones, are actually designed in such a way that they differ by the same physical amount. And this is exactly how categorical perception shows up. So the idea is that discriminating nearby pairs of stimuli on either side of a category boundary is dramatically easier than discriminating pairs from within a category. So the trick behind this pattern of discrimination is that even though the two pairs of stimuli are designed to be equally different in purely physical terms, the fact that the two ones above fall into two different color categories, by and large I would say blue and purple, and the two bottom ones fall into the same color category, namely green, makes it the case that it's much easier to discriminate the two ones above than it is to discriminate the two ones below. And so this is the essence of categorical perception. Some pairs of stimuli are easier to discriminate than others, and what explains this is that those pairs of stimuli fall into different categories, that the subjects are typically capable of recognizing. So if you ask subjects what color these different hues are, they will be capable of responding blue, purple, and green. Now, let me give you evidence that humans categorically perceive facial expressions of certain emotions. Now, in the light of what I said earlier, this is going to amount to the fact that the processing of facial expressions of certain emotions exhibits patterns of heightened discrimination along the lines of what I showed for colors. So how is this shown? The way in which this is tested is by constructing stimuli in the following way. So on the one hand, you start out with facial expressions, characteristic facial expressions of certain emotions, such as happiness and fear, and then you morph these images one into the other in such a way as to produce a series of stimuli, morphed stimuli, that have the characteristic that each adjacent pair differs by a fixed amount. So it's a similar principle with respect to the pairs of color hues that I showed you previously. So these are designed in such a way that each adjacent pair differs by a fixed physical amount. Now, what you do is to show single adjacent pairs to a subject, and again, you ask them, are these stimuli the same or different? You ask this for example, this pair, or this one, and lastly, this one. What you might notice for yourself is that saying whether these two last faces are the same or different is a lot easier than with any of the previous pairs of faces. What explains this is that there is a category boundary between these two, which there wasn't between any of the previous stimuli. These are both happy faces and these are both fearful ones, whereas in this case we have a happy face and a fearful one. And this is what makes it the case that this last pair is easier to discriminate. What explains this is that the two stimuli fall across a category boundary rather than both within the same category, even though the stimuli are designed to be equally different in purely physical terms. So the interim conclusion, due to this kind of experimental evidence, is that humans categorically perceive facial expressions of certain emotions. Now, what I want to show is that facial expressions of some emotions and motor actions are species of the same genus. What is the genus in question? It is what I'm going to call for short AMROS. This stands for actions directed to motorically represented outcomes. What does this mean? It means that these are actions whose outcomes rely for their achievement on the guidance of a motor representation. And so this is the point at which we start to move towards the underlying mechanisms from the behavioral point of view. So what is a motor representation? A motor representation is a representation of an action in the brain that specifies the pattern of bodily movements that are going to be performed. This is a functional notion borrowed from the neuroscience of action. And it has a neural counterpart, which is populations of neurons in the premotor cortex that fire in correlation with the bringing about of certain motor outcomes and sometimes the observation of the bringing about of these outcomes. So in particular, when, for example, you perform a grasping action, there's going to be a population of neurons that fires in correlation with that, and that's the neural counterpart of the motor representation of grasping. Now, this gives rise to a criterion for actions being AMROS, and the criterion is that the outcome of certain actions should rely on a motor representation for its achievement. This is what makes an action an AMRO, an action directed to a motorically represented outcome. Now, Stephen Butterfield has observed that bodily expressions of emotions are AMROS. So he says, note that expressing an emotion by, say, smiling or frowning involves making coordinated movements of multiple muscles. That this is a goal-directed action follows just from its involving motor expertise and being coordinated around an outcome in virtue of the outcome being represented motorically. So we, at this point, learn that facial expressions, or in general bodily expressions of emotions, are AMROS. What about motor actions? Are they AMROS? Notice that this is not at all obvious. Recall that motor actions were defined in behavioral terms as actions directed to motor outcomes, where a motor outcome is an outcome whose specification involves reference to bodily configurations and an object in relation to which these unfold. So the question that we need to ask in order to establish whether motor actions are AMROS is to ask whether they are represented by motor representations. And it turns out that they are. I mean, we can find evidence to the effect that populations of neurons in the premotor cortex represent indeed motor outcomes, such as something being grasped or being reached. For example, the same population of neurons fires in correlation with the grasping act, regardless of the effector. We can also find representation of grasping that are effector specific and specific for a certain kind of grip. But this is the kind of evidence that tells us that motor actions are AMROS. So in virtue of their outcomes being represented by motor representations, motor actions are AMROS. Indeed, are species of the same genus to which facial expressions of some emotions belong. So in virtue of all these outcomes being represented by motor representations. This is the interim conclusion. Now, is this enough to conjecture that the same kind of processing, categorical perception, might apply to both kinds of domain? Well, maybe not yet, because you might think that even though these are species of the same genus, maybe we have categorical perception of facial expressions of emotion in virtue of something specific about that domain that does not extend to motor actions. So let me add to the observation that these two domains are species of the same genus, that there is evidence for cross-processing among the two domains. And in particular, it has been shown that areas involving the production of some motor actions may contribute to the understanding of emotions, thus showing a tighter link also in terms of processing between these two domains, motor actions and facial expressions of some emotions. So to sum up, I take this path to lead to the conjecture that motor actions are also categorically perceived, namely they're subject to the same processing as other AMROs, such as facial expressions of some emotions. This works on the assumption that there is evidence to the effect that facial expressions of certain emotions are categorically perceived. Secondly, that facial expressions of certain emotions are actions directed to motorically represented outcomes. I have observed that motor actions also belong to this larger domain, and I have mentioned evidence to the effect that there is cross-processing among these two domains. So I take this, well, not conclusively showing that motor actions are categorically perceived. I take it that this makes it plausible that motor actions are categorically perceived. And naturally, this is subject to being properly tested. Now, given that I am putting forward the conjecture that motor actions are categorically perceived, I should say a little something about what the categories are in which these stimuli are sorted by subjects. And the most reasonable thing to say is that the categories are motor outcomes. And motor action types, it can be shown from a motor vocabulary. So the kind of evidence that I alluded to previously to show that motor outcomes rely on motor representations for their achievement is also evidence that has been taken to show that these neural populations form some sort of motor vocabulary where different motor actions can be mapped to different populations of neurons. And so the outcomes coded by these populations could be the categories into which motor actions are sorted. Okay, now I've come to the end of my path towards this conjecture, and now let me go back to the options for how motor actions could be understood that I started with. These options were behavior reading and outcome identification. Just to remind you, the former is supposed to be a completely bottom-up process, whereas outcome identification is supposed to be a more complex process, including top-down elements, such as relying on information about outcomes and disregarding some details about the low-level kinematic features. And the question is, assuming that the conjecture is true, assuming that humans do categorically perceive motor actions, what does this tell us about which of these options is likely to better explain the understanding of motor actions? And in order to provide some conclusions about this, let me offer a parallel with the case of the categorical perception of colors. So in that case, the observed patterns of discrimination make it more explanatory to suppose that in discriminating color hues, individuals are identifying color categories rather than color hues. And likewise, in the case of discriminating motor actions, on the basis of the conjecture, it seems more plausible that individuals are identifying outcomes rather than relying just on low-level kinematic details. And this makes it the case that it's more likely that humans understand motor actions by outcome identification rather than by means of pure behavior reading. And so this is a consequence, one consequence of adopting this conjecture for getting a better sense of how motor actions could be understood. So in conclusion, I have presented a path to the conjecture that humans categorically perceive motor actions. I hope I have made it reasonable that this could be the case. And of course, this is subject to then being experimentally tested. And I've also shown that this favors the hypothesis that motor actions are understood by identifying outcomes rather than by means of behavior reading. Thanks very much.